Hi, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's webinar, which is all about cracking the code, explaining the SAT, ACT, and test optional. My name is Kathy Hart, and I am your presenter this evening and look forward to spending about the next hour or so with you. Tonight's webinar is a really great presentation for our younger students in the audience tonight. So juniors, this is a great opportunity to get a overview about what comprises each of those two tests, SAT and ACT, as well as learn a little bit more about a good testing schedule you might want to set up in the next year or so. My younger students, this is also a great webinar for you. So my ninth and 10th graders, even though you might not be planning to take your SAT or ACT for another couple of years, this will also help give you a little bit of insight into those tests. And certainly my seniors, chances are at this point you are finishing up those SAT and ACT test scores, or maybe making those final determination about test optional colleges. And I certainly hope to give you some information that might help you in those final few, I guess, couple of months of the college application process. All right, so let me go into my presentation. All right, we are moving forward here. So as always, we are broadcasting on our different social media channels, and we are also making a recording of this webinar, and that will be posted within a day or two of this evening. So if you need to leave early, you can always go back and rewatch this. We've got a lot of downloads for this webinar, including those testing calendars that I've mentioned, one for juniors and seniors, another for sophomores. So when I get to that part of the presentation, you don't need to worry about trying to grab screenshots or take any notes. There is another document that compares the SAT and ACT, which I will cover as well as some information about the Florida University admission statistics, the latest ones, and also our SAT and ACT workshop schedule. And just a little bit of housekeeping. It is just me in the studio this evening. So unfortunately, I cannot see your questions live, but I do invite you to put them in the chat. And at the end of my presentation, I will come back, I'll take a look, answer any questions that are there. And I'm also going to provide my email should you have any follow-up questions or you think of something after our presentation. So let's get into it. So our agenda should be pretty straightforward this evening. I'm going to give you an overview of the SAT, followed by an overview of the ACT, with some discussions of those recent changes to both tests, as well as a side-by-side comparison. We'll talk about a good testing calendar, and then we'll explore test optional and when you may want to or not want to send test scores to a college. So how to use some of that data to determine that. All right, so looking at our most important factors in college admissions, you can see here that SAT or ACT scores do round out that academic piece of your application. So first and foremost, colleges, regardless of selectivity, want to see evidence that you are prepared to handle the rigors of a college education. So certainly first and foremost, students who are applying with full year grades from 9, 10, 11. Sometimes they have a few middle school classes that counted towards those ninth grade classes also appearing on their transcript. So colleges do understand that they're looking at that record that you accumulated over 3 years. And they're certainly looking for grades that reflect an upward trend. Now, the SAT and the ACT, a strong score there, kind of rounds out that academic piece, shows that you were ready to handle the challenges of a college education. All right, so let's start out by discussing the SAT. And for my students tonight who may be taking their PSAT this October, whether it's ninth graders, 10th graders, certainly juniors, if you have the opportunity to take a PSAT this fall, certainly recommend it. It'll help give you a little bit of additional practice for a future SAT. But let's talk about this test. All right, so the move from a paper-based test to a strictly digital test, you cannot take a paper-based SAT or PSAT. This was the biggest change in SAT's history. So now students, when they go in to take the SAT on a Saturday morning, they're not sharpening their number 2 pencils and making sure those erasers are still intact. They're bringing in a device, or they have made sure to sign up for a test site which has devices available. The test is now adaptive. More on that in a moment. It's still scored on that familiar 1,600-point scale that's been around for a long time. Calculator is allowed for all math. And our recent high school graduates, so my class of 2025, they were the first US class to take the digital SAT. One of the things that students really like about this new digital format is that it's a much shorter test. Before, it used to come in at around 3 hours, and now it's just a little over 2 hours in length. Gone are these long reading passages. Questions are more concise and straightforward. There are overall fewer questions with more time per question, so students don't feel as rushed. But don't worry, it's still a challenging test. All right, let's talk about the adaptive nature of the SAT and what does this mean? So it is section adaptive, not question adaptive. So let's look at how that works. When I sit for the SAT, and this is also true for the PSAT, I'm going to start with the reading and writing section, followed by the math section. Now, each section is broken into 2 modules that have the same timing and the same number of questions. When I sit for that first module, I'm going to notice a broad array of questions. And of course, level of difficulty can vary from student to student, as we all know, but I can see easy questions, medium questions, difficult questions. And then, depending on my performance in the first module, the module 2 that will unlock will either be an easier module or a harder module. So just to give you a little example, so for instance, I tutor the SAT, the reading and writing. I do not touch the math. So I know when I have done those practice tests, I can tell my module 2 for reading and writing is definitely the harder one. I can see the vocabulary is advanced. The reading passages, although short, are very dense. They're pretty complex. When I do the math, however, since I am not a math tutor or a math instructor, I can clearly tell that my module 2 sometimes is easier than my first module. I'm seeing a lot of pre-algebra, algebra 1 type questions. And then you're going to get a score of 200 to 800 for each section. So add those together. That's going to give you your overall score of 400 to 1600. And the score is based on the number correct as well as the level of difficulty. Now, one of the things that we were wondering when the digital adaptive test rolled out, were students going to get a little bit distracted, worrying, am I in module 2? Am I getting the harder test? Am I getting the easier test? And we found that hasn't been the case. And again, as you work through your test prep, you'll get lots of practice, work with a good instructor to familiarize yourself, get more practice on those difficult questions. And as we always say, do your best on both modules. All right, so let's look at the breakdown of those sections. So again, I start with the reading writing section, and both modules are going to have the same timing, 32 minutes, and the same number of questions, 27. I'll get a little pause when I receive the second module. Then I'm going to have a short break in between my reading and writing and my math. And then math section, again, 2 modules, same timing at 35 minutes, same total number of questions at 22 for each module. And I'll also see both multiple choice and some grid-ins. Now, in each module, there are going to be two pre-test questions. So these are the experimental questions. This is how the SAT determines some of those future questions that may appear on future tests. You will not know which questions are experimental or which questions are going to count towards that section score. So again, do your best. ACT, by the way, and I'll talk about this later, has done something similar. Again, the test is adaptive, and this is also improved test security, meaning, and you shouldn't do this anyway, if you were going to look over at the student next to you, they should have a completely different test. So each student should get a unique test, but it still should be highly comparable in the level of difficulty and those types of questions. Now, how do I take this digital test? Well, if you haven't yet, I encourage you to check out the Blue Book app. You will need to download it. And on the Blue Book app, you can access 7 practice SATs and 2 practice PSATs. So great to do these practice tests, get familiar with the timing, the features of the app. How do I use the calculator? How do I use the annotation tool? And then after you complete a practice test, you'll log into your College Board account and you'll get your practice test scores along with the questions you got correct and incorrect and answer explanations. Now, you are also going to use this same app on your test taking day. So this is the actual test taking platform. So you should receive instructions before you arrive at the test center to make sure if you are bringing your own device to have Blue Book installed. And then once you're there, you will connect to College Board, and that way you'll download your encrypted test modules. And again, rollout of this test, the movement to digital seems to be pretty streamlined. Occasionally we might hear some technology difficulties, but overall it seems to have been successful. All right, so let's look at the content of my SAT. So reading and writing is now mixed. So I'm going to have some questions that pertain to reading skills, and I'm going to have some questions that pertain to writing skills. And sometimes they seem a little bit of a mixture of each, right? Because there's a lot of overlap between those two skill sets. So, but I can usually tell which questions are reading, which questions are writing. I'll see some vocabulary and context. I'll see some main idea, conclusion, inference, reading skills questions. I'll see some clear grammar error questions. So I'll be able to discern which content area I am being tested on. So just to be aware that gone are those long reading passages with multiple questions for each passage. Now the SAT has, for the reading, 1 short passage and 1 question per passage. And the same is true with the writing-based questions. You can also see some visual text in some of these passages. And there's a good array of content. I can see some literature, I may see some poetry, I might see some science, some humanities. And just to be aware, don't be fooled. Even though the passage length might be short, it is very dense. And when you're dealing with a passage that short, every word typically counts. So do read closely. You really can't skim through these. Again, you're going to see the types of questions that you might find on any reading and writing assessment, right? So we're going to talk about vocabulary and context, reading comprehension questions. When it comes to grammar, I may be asked, punctuation questions, verb tense, pronoun agreement, making transitions between, within sentences, between sentences. And there's also some detailed oriented questions where I might have to read a series of notes and analyze the information found within. All right, so let's go on to math. So the math modules are always going to draw from these 4 content areas, and algebra has always been king for the SAT. So certainly we always advise students, once you finish that Algebra 2 class, typically you have most of the math needed for your SAT. So again, we're looking at a lot of algebra, advanced math, problem solving, data analysis, and just a little bit of geometry and trigonometry. Now, what's nice about SAT math is you do get a formula sheet, which you can hide and unhide as needed while you are taking the test. Questions typically progress from easiest to hardest and will also include some free response questions. All right, so hopefully you've got a bit of an understanding of the SAT and its makeup. And now let's talk about that perennial question, right? Should I take the SAT, the ACT? So, first of all, I think it's always good to dispel that myth. Colleges treat SAT and ACT exactly the same. That is the truth. That is the fact. There's always sometimes some information out there. Someone heard that this school prefers the SAT, or someone heard that this school wants to see an ACT. So ignore those rumblings there, and just be aware that colleges will take your SAT and ACT exactly the same. Now, where there might be a little variation is sometimes colleges may superscore an SAT and may not superscore an ACT, or sometimes they don't superscore either. So definitely look closely at the college's testing policies. These are usually laid out pretty clearly on a college's admissions site. And if you're not sure, you can always reach out and ask. So, really, at the end of the day, it's up to you, the student, to determine which of those two tests is going to be the best choice for you. And when I talk more about the calendar or testing calendar, one of the things I'm going to advise, and I may as well say it right now, is try one of each. Usually, most students are going to take a PSAT sometime in the fall, sometimes as early as 8th grade, sometimes 9th grade, 10th grade. They will definitely sit for their PSAT. And many times juniors will still have the option to take a PSAT in the fall of that year. So that can be a great resource, especially if you go in and you take it seriously, to get an idea of what a possible SAT score may look like. Then you do have some time to try an ACT, or you can even take a practice ACT to do some side-by-side comparison. So let me give you some more information about the ACT to help you make that decision. But certainly, as in with many things, it's always a good idea to get some firsthand knowledge and give it a try. So the ACT just rolled out its own changes, which they're calling it enhancement. So we were talking about the enhanced ACT. That's actually the ACT going forward. But let me just give you a little insight into what some of those changes are. So it is now a shorter test. There is more time per question. If anyone tonight in the audience, maybe some of my seniors, sat for a classic ACT in their junior year, they would have found it really is a race. It is a fast test. Now it's still overall less time per question than what the SAT offers. But for the ACT, you are getting a little bit more time per question, which is nice. The reading and English passages, while still long, are not as long as they used to be. And there are fewer questions per passage. So again, you're going to get kind of a long column of text and then 9 questions or so, which you'll answer about that text. Fewer math questions. The science and writing sections are both optional now. I'm going to talk more about science optional in just a moment. But let me just briefly bring up that the writing test has been optional for a good number of years. Colleges don't look at the score, even if students take it. There's only a handful of colleges out there that require it or recommend it or will even look at it. It's a very, very short list. So indeed, we haven't advised students to sign up for the writing test in a good number of years. Science is a different story, so more on those changes in a bit. Just like the SAT, now the ACT is embedding those experimental questions within the questions that count towards your score. So gone. I remember hearing from students who would sit for a Saturday ACT, and they would say, "Oh, I finished taking my 4 sections, and then I had to sit for a 5th section, and that was the experimental section." But now those questions are embedded within the question list for each subtest. And so students, again, likely don't know which question counts towards a score, which question is experimental. The ACT continues to be both a paper-based and digital test. Students always had the option to take it digital, but most students preferred the paper. And many students, with the rollout of the enhanced ACT, have continued to sign up for the paper-based test. And it's also a linear test. It is not moved to that adaptive format like the SAT has. All right, a few other pieces of information with our new ACT here. So before the ACT required science, so your composite score used to be an average of those 4 subtests: English, math, reading, science. Now, the science no longer counts towards that composite score. So for every domestic ACT taken, starting the one that was just this past weekend, your composite score, whether you take it digital, paper-based, is going to be the average of the English, math, and reading only. If you're taking the science test, you're still going to get a science score. It is still going to appear on your score report, but it's not going to be averaged into your composite. Or once you start taking multiple tests, it won't be averaged in your super score. But the science will be included in the STEM score, which is going to be the average of science and math. Talking about a lot of flexible testing pathways, right? So when you sit down to register for the ACT, if you're planning to take it October, December, February, you can sign up for the core test, English, math, reading. You can choose to add science. You could choose to add writing. You could choose to add science and writing. So you get a couple of different testing options there. And overall, it is now a shorter test. So it's just a little over 2 hours without the science and the writing. If you take it with the science, it's going to be a bit closer to 3 hours. So it's going to come in at 2 hours and 45 minutes. And again, the rollout started this past spring with our digital tests. Now going forward with September, that was just this past weekend, paper-based, digital, you are going to be taking that core ACT with the science optional. And some school districts use the ACT for district testing, and those students taking a district test will still see the classic ACT with a mandatory science, more questions, but that is supposed to go away starting spring of 2026. All right. So let's do a side-by-side comparison, which I hope will help you make that determination of which test might be the better for you. All right, so we already talked at length about the SAT, but just a little reminder, you get those 2 sections. There's a total of 98 questions, 2 hours and 14 minutes total, strictly digital. The ACT, without the optional essay, is comprised of the following 4 sections. So English, math, reading, you're always going to take that. The addition of science, it is optional now. And then you're going to have a total of 171 questions if you take the test with science. If you don't take it with science, that will be reduced to 131 questions. Timing, it's still going to be a little bit longer if you elect to take science at 2 hours and 45 minutes. But if you don't take the science, you're going to come in at just over 2 hours. So comparable in length there. SAT is still overall a shorter test, certainly in terms of number of questions. All right. So we already talked about the SAT reading and writing section, how reading and writing questions are combined. And let's talk about the ACT reading section. So you're still going to see 4 reading passages. 3 are single author. You'll then see 1 paired passage. You may see some visual text also in the ACT reading. You're going to have 36 questions to answer in 40 minutes. So it's about 9 questions per passage. However, 9 of those questions are going to be experimental, meaning they're not going to count towards your reading subsection score of that 1 to 36. You're going to read through the passage. It's going to be followed by several questions. And these are going to be longer passages, but not quite as long as they used to be. And you're going to get 40 minutes to complete the reading test. The writing test on the ACT is called English. And it is actually going to be your very first subtest. So when you open up your booklet or go onto your digital platform, that is going to be the first ACT section that you're going to see is the English test. It is also writing. And by the way, just to reiterate that all of these questions, writing and English, there is no actual writing. These are all multiple choice. Just want to clarify. This is also a passage-based test. You get 35 minutes. There are a total of 5 passages, 50 questions, so 10 questions per passage. 10 of these questions are going to be experimental, so they're not going to count towards that English score there. And what you're going to do, and it's pretty familiar if you practice an ACT, is you're pretty much going to read through the passage. You'll see some part of a sentence or maybe an entire sentence underlined. There'll be a number you'll go over. You'll make a grammar correction. You'll revise the sentence. You'll answer some sort of question. So usually you're reading the passage and answering the English questions as you go along. Whereas with the ACT reading, sometimes students like to start by at least doing a nice overview read, maybe a little bit of a skim for that longer passage before attacking the questions there. And overall, the total time for reading in English, now on the ACT, they are 2 separate tests, is going to be 75 minutes. And just note the difference between the SAT. Remember, reading and writing is combined, so it's going to be 64 minutes for those 2 modules. ACT reading, you're going to see prose fiction, social science, humanities, natural science. Don't believe there's going to be any poetry on there, unlike the SAT. You may also see some visual text. And for the writing English questions type, again, these are going to be pretty familiar. It's going to be questions about grammar and usage, punctuation, structure, rhetoric, pronoun agreement, subject verb agreement. Usually the English section is pretty direct with its types of grammar questions for the ACT. Now, don't forget on the SAT, you will see some writing questions, and those typically follow after the reading focus questions. All right, let's talk about our math. Now, ACT has always been a bit more geometry heavy than the SAT. The SAT loves its algebra. Don't worry, you're going to see some algebra on the ACT. Just a little heads up that you do not get a formula sheet for the ACT. So on your Blue Book app, for your SAT and for your PSAT, there's a formula sheet that you can expand and hide as needed. On the ACT, whether you're doing booklet or digital, there won't be a formula sheet. So always a good idea to brush up on some of those geometry formulas, especially if it's been a couple of years since you studied that subject. Just to be aware that both tests allow for calculators for all questions. And for the ACT, if you're taking the test digitally, there will be a built-in calculator. That is also true on the Blue Book app. If you are taking a paper-based ACT, Don't forget to bring your own calculator. You will not be provided one by the testing site. And actually, this is true for both the SAT and ACT digital formats. You are still allowed to bring in and use your own calculator. If you're more comfortable doing so, you don't have to use the built-in calculator. On both sites, there is a page that tells you which calculators are approved for use on the test. So just to be aware that that you are allowed to do that. You'll also be given some scratch paper for the digital tests as well. And let me see here. Oh yes, and also for the ACT, you're going to have 45 multiple choice math questions, no grid-ins, and 4 of those are going to be experimental, meaning they're not going to count to that overall math score. Again, as I mentioned several times now, SAT is really algebra focused, algebra heavy, and expect to see a little bit more variety of math on the ACT, including some more geometry and just a bit of that side by side. The SAT, you're going to be spending 70 minutes on math. So divided between those 2 modules, ACT is 50 minutes for the math. All right, so now let's talk about the science section and give you some insight, at least for what we know as of right now, about whether or not you should take the science section. So let's first of all start with the SAT. The SAT has never offered a science section, but they intersperse questions that have you use science-based skills to answer them, such as analyzing graphic data, or perhaps in a reading passage. And I've seen this when I've done some of the practice tests. You're reading a really dense, again, it's short but dense, and you're wading through perhaps a report on a scientific study or something of that nature. So again, science isn't tested directly or explicitly on the SAT, but those skills are interwoven in both sections of the test. ACT does have a separate science test. It is always the final test on the ACT. So again, you start with English, math, short break, reading, science if you're taking it. Science is also a passage-based test. You get 40 minutes. There are 40 questions, 6 of which are experimental. Those are divided among 7 passages. And ACT science has always been more of a reasoning reading test and less of a knowledge-based test. Now, you do have to have some familiarity. You might have to know some chemical formulas like NaCl is sodium chloride. I do remember that from taking chemistry a bazillion years ago. A lot of it is reading short scientific focused passages, analyzing tables, graphs, and charts. So that's what the science section is. And really, again, it really is in many ways more of a reading type test than it is an actual science test. Now, let's talk about science since it's optional, and should we take it or should we not take it? So I'll just preface this by saying, actually, my final bullet point is many colleges are still deciding policies. They've set policies for this year, but again, we don't know what following years are going to look like. Science for many colleges is optional or not required, but certainly you can still take the science test and share those results. They will appear on your score report, and you will get the option to self-report them on the application or on the college's own portal. Now, we work with many students in the state of Florida who are interested in achieving the Bright Future Scholarship. I'll show you those stats momentarily. And the Bright Future Scholarship, up until really through the summer, was requiring students to continue taking science. So juniors, signing up for some of those early SATs, fall senior year, signed up for the science test. But as of right now, Bright Futures is now saying that the science is optional and that if you submit ACT results with a science score, it will be used to calculate a composite. If you do not take the ACT with science, they will calculate a composite without it. Um, and just so you're aware that even if you do choose to take the ACT with science, that when you get your composite score, that will no longer include science in the average. It'll just be the average of the English, the math, and the reading subtests. And then once you start taking multiple ACTs and you get a composite super score, science will not be factored into that super score. But just to be aware that colleges may still use it in their own recalculations if it's submitted. So certainly right now it's a little bit up in the air. What is science, what is the future of the ACT science? And certainly if you are interested in a STEM major, another, quantitative major, we think it is a great idea to continue to take science, especially given that there is a lot that's unknown about it. And there are some colleges out there that want to see science that will only super score tests that have in which students have taken science. So it's a little bit up in the air at the moment. So our recommendation certainly is, if you're registering for an ACT, so this will be true of maybe my seniors who are finishing up their testing this fall, maybe I have some juniors who are looking to take a December, February ACT, be safe and sign up for the science. All right, so let's talk about scoring the two tests. Now, we already talked about the SAT, is you're going to get two section scores of 200 to 800. Add those together, that's going to give you your overall score, 400 to 1600. And this is also true for the PSAT, except for those scales are a little lower because the PSAT is an easier test. Now, not all questions are worth the same on the SAT because you take into account the adaptive nature of the test. Now, for the ACT, I've been talking about these scale scores. So how does this work? So after you take your English test, you're going to get a score of 1 to 36 based on the total number correct. So level of difficulty isn't factored in. You're not getting any sort of deduction for any incorrect answers. So it's a linear test. Same thing for the math. Based on the total number correct, you'll get a scale score of 1 to 36. Same for the reading. And same for the science if you take it. And then for the composite score, which is the overall score, remember with this new ACT, or I guess I should not stop calling it a new ACT, right? It is the now ACT. So for my now ACT, my composite score, which is going to be 1 through 36, will be the average of English, math, and reading. So you just add those up, divide by 3, and that is your composite score. All right, so let's talk about when to test and how to make that determination between SAT and ACT. So my juniors, this is really going to pertain to you because you're probably starting out this year with this in mind, especially if you're planning to apply to college next fall and you are doing some research on your colleges, and I'll talk a little bit more about test optional. So if you want to take the ACT, usually the best dates that we recommend are the dates following your October PSAT. And if you do get the option to take the PSAT, strongly recommend it. Colleges don't see the scores, but it is a really great way for you to prepare for your SAT should you take one spring of your junior year, which many students do. And also gives you that opportunity to have a score in hand. And then if you want to try the ACT, you certainly may. So again, December, February, usually great testing times for juniors to compare that score to the junior year PSAT. And then you've got a few more options into the spring, April, June, and July. Now, the three tests that are asterisked, including my upcoming October 28th, are the my answer key score dates. So what does this mean? When I go to register for my October ACT, my April, my June, I will be given the option to sign up for the my answer key. And what this is, you pay a little bit extra and you do get a copy of your test, a copy of your answers, and an answer key. And this is an excellent, excellent study tool to prepare for future ACTs. ACT scores come out pretty quickly, usually within 10 days of taking the test date. Now, what about the SAT? So again, many juniors are probably not going to sit for a late fall, early winter SAT. We only recommend sitting for this test if you have enough time to prepare. By the way, I didn't mention it yet, but the ACT does allow you to cancel your scores at any time, even after you get your scores back. There is a form online, so you always have control of your scores. The SAT, you only get a few business days after taking the test, so before you have your results, to cancel a score. So again, take an SAT only after you have had time to prep for it. Better, take that PSAT fall of your junior year. Now, many juniors will sit for a school day SAT, March or April. That's great. You can take your first SAT then. Strongly recommend doing some prep leading up to it. So, in that 8 weeks leading up to it. And then you do have time to take the test again. So, if I take it in March, I can take it again in May. Sometimes that's a busy time of year. We know we're going into testing season at school, AP exams. So sometimes students may choose to wait and take that early June testing date. Scores come out about 2 weeks after the test. And then for seniors, so if you still need a higher score after taking your junior year test, is you do have some options in your senior year. So for the SAT, you've got 5 options to take an SAT starting in late August through the beginning of December. And then the ACT offers sittings in September, October, and December. And just to be aware, and this is a little tip for any of my seniors who might be listening in this evening, that even after you have submitted applications and your current scores, you can, in most instances, still send additional improved scores. And sometimes this can be to your advantage if, say, you got deferred from a college and they want first semester grades, senior year grades, and they may ask for additional testing. So you can continue to test into your junior year and senior year and my current juniors. This can hopefully help you map out a good testing calendar. Recommend not starting your SAT or ACT in senior year and trying to get that testing done, especially since we know it's a busy fall with senior stuff and also college applications. Always a good idea to get that testing done sooner than later, but certainly you do have additional options. Now, again, use that PSAT to get an idea of where your SAT scores may fall. Sign up for that late fall, early winter ACT. Then you get that nice side-by-side comparison, not only of what your scores are like, but also what was the test experience like? Some students just don't like that digital format. And for the SAT, that is the only option. So the nice thing about ACT is you can continue to take that as a paper-based test. The timing for the ACT, again, even though it is shorter, it is still fewer seconds per question. So it's a little bit more speed. SAT gives you more time per question, but the questions tend to be a lot denser. So do give both a try and then look and see whichever one plays to your strengths, where you feel most successful at. Use those scores. That can help you focus on your testing path. So given you a lot of information about SAT and ACT. So let's talk about that final part of our pathway is test optional. So let me just go through some of these points pretty briefly. So many colleges went test optional in response to the pandemic, going back about 5 years ago, when students just had a difficult time finding testing sites. And many continue to remain test optional. Now, test optional can vary, and I'm going to show you how that is in just a moment. Test optional does not mean test blind. If a college is test blind, it means that even if you send scores, they will not use them in admissions. Test optional means you have the option to send scores, and yes, if you send them, the colleges will use them. And just to be aware that admission can be more competitive for test optional schools. And one of the results was that students, once that testing requirement was removed, many students thought, oh, great, now I can just apply to all these schools without test scores. And what that ended up doing was driving down admission rates as applications increased. To keep up with the latest and greatest of test optional colleges, encourage you, especially my juniors this year, as you're starting to build those college lists, take a look at this site, fairtest.org. It's a nonprofit. It's updated daily, as you can see, as testing policies update. Again, we work with a lot of Florida students, so just to be aware that our 12 state universities never went test optional, continue to require scores. University of Miami is joining them this fall as well, as does the Bright Futures Scholarship, with a couple of exceptions. Test submitter advantage, again, you can see some data. Now it is from a few years ago, but you can see back when some colleges chose to share this information, you can see that there was an advantage to being admitted with scores versus without scores. And some of these schools on the list, such as Cornell, let's see, Penn, Georgia Tech, Georgetown, have since gone back to requiring scores. So test optional can be test preferred in practice. And sometimes, even if a college is fully test optional, sometimes you have to kind of check out the data, and you can usually find this. You can see this on the iPad site. You can also look at the common data set that colleges publish, and you can see the percentage of students who submitted scores to test optional colleges. And you may be at a disadvantage if the majority of applicants are submitting test scores. There is a growing list of selective colleges requiring scores that had been temporarily test optional, but have now since gone back to requiring scores. University of Miami this year, Ohio State, Stanford, and there's some others that went back to requiring scores a bit sooner. So again, just keep an eye out on a college's website just to get a feel of what might be required when it is your time to apply to college. One of the things that we are starting to see is sometimes colleges, new is Caltech requiring AP exam scores, and sometimes colleges will say, well, if you can't provide an SAT or ACT, we would really strongly encourage you to send your AP results or any IB results. So sometimes, if it's not required, it may be encouraged. I mentioned earlier that Bright Futures does require the submission of an SAT or ACT or the CLT, the Classic Learning Test, in order to receive this scholarship, which is a very lucrative scholarship that our Florida students do like to take advantage of. And by the way, I will be covering the Bright Futures Scholarship in greater detail sometime in January or February. I forget the exact date it's scheduled, but don't worry, I'm going to go through this grid in much greater detail than this evening. But just to give you an idea, students who wish to receive the FAS, the highest level of scholarship, need to have an ACT of 29, an SAT of 1330. And for that next tier down, the Florida Medallion Scholars, FMS, students need to have an SAT of 1190 and an ACT of 24. And yes, the Bright Futures does superscore both tests. Let me just give you a quick overview of a test preferred school. And this is Auburn University that also announced that beginning fall 2027, all first-year applicants will be required to submit ACT or SAT scores. And I'm not going to read through every word on the screen, but you can just see here for fall 2026 admission only, a very limited number of exceptionally qualified applicants with at least a 3.6 GPA may be considered without test scores. Less than 5% of the applicant pool will be considered under the test optional pathway. So just to point out, as you, the students, again, knowledge is power, right? So as you're starting to do your research, spend some time on the school's testing site, really kind of dig in deep to the language that they're using if they're test optional. Check out that common data set to see the students who were, what percentage of students who enrolled, submitted test scores, so you can make an informed decision. So if I am going test optional, just a couple of things to take into account. So some students, are unlikely to benefit from test optional. So, students that may have had the time, the resource, the opportunity to test, students who may be academically weaker. Remember, if we're going to be looking at those grades from 9, 10, 11, we're going to be looking at that rigor. We're hoping for an upward trend in grades versus a downward one your junior year. But certainly having a test score, especially for a student that may be academically weaker, especially if it's a strong test score, can really, send a strong message that, in spite of some of these weaker grades, the student is still ready to handle the rigors of a college education. Students who may benefit from test optional might be students who are recruited athletes, who have overcome hardships, again, who may have come from, under-resourced backgrounds, students who already have solid academics and extracurriculars. And at the end of the day, certainly we know that colleges certainly would do benefit from test optional policies. It does drive up the number of applications, and that can lead to a greater prestige, ranking, and selectivity. So again, if you don't have test scores, and we certainly know that even in test optional, that there is going to be, test scores will absolutely be used, just to be aware that if you're applying without test scores, there is going to be a greater emphasis on those other parts of your application. So of course, the academic record, right? You want to have very strong grades. You want to make sure that that rigor is there, AP, honors, IB, whatever, you've challenged yourself appropriately. You have some good extracurricular commitments. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have joined every single club in your high school, but you should have several extracurriculars that show leadership, impact, and also a long-term commitment. And of course, you want your letters of recommendation and your essays to also sparkle and really help you stand out. Now, one final piece of the webinar as we get towards the end, and this may be helpful for my seniors tonight, is should I send my scores or not? And I feel like these are some of the conversations that we start to have with our seniors, especially as they begin to wrap up testing. So many seniors have taken their August, September SAT, they've taken a September ACT, maybe they're going to take it one more time in October, but they kind of know at this point, right? Where, have test scores been going up consistently? Are they starting to plateau out? So the key question is always going to be, will your SAT or ACT scores strengthen or weaken your application? So certainly, good scores at or above a college's median are actually even what we're seeing now, even if it's just a little bit below that median, but close, it's certainly going to strengthen your application. Weaker scores, especially significantly weaker scores, are going to distract from your application. Now, there are exceptions. Sometimes students may take the SAT or ACT, and even if it's not quite at a college's median, it might be in the top percentile for their high school. And that information is usually shared to the colleges via a school profile. So if you're a student, certainly who has an SAT or ACT score that's at the top of your list, it may be to your advantage to submit. Always, 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 if you're not sending an SAT or ACT score, don't forget to self report those AP scores. Usually, fours or fives are what you want to share with highly selective colleges, threes or higher for colleges that are less selective. And you can also report any future test plans. So, for instance, if you're a senior and you have 3 AP classes on your schedule this year, don't forget on the testing page of your application, of your Common App, you can report that you are planning to sit for those 3 AP exams in May 2026. So here's kind of a good rule of thumb. And remember that there is a little nuance. So above median, submit. Below median, but in range, maybe. And actually, we've kind of updated that advice a bit to say more, leaning more towards yes. Below range, don't submit. And again, I mentioned those exceptions. And so here, for instance, let's say I have an an SAT of a 1250, right? So I take a look at this chart and I see for App State, all right, that 1250 is certainly above that college's mid 50. So it's probably to my advantage to submit. But it is significantly lower by 200 points for Amherst. So I probably don't want to submit. So again, and this will only apply to a college with a test optional policy. So you can take that into account. So we wrap up the evening. Certainly invite you to consider us for your test prep needs, as well as academic tutoring, courses for credit, and college counseling. We have had a lot of really good college admission webinars recently. Judy Rabinovitz just gave her trends in college admissions, and I know she talked about test optional and the return to test preferred as part of that conversation. And next week she has her very popular Florida's Dozen, so helping you students learn more about what it takes to get into one of our 12 state university schools. If you want to go back and watch any of our previously recorded webinars, we have a great one that Ellen and I co-led about college application essays. We have a Common App walkthrough. We have a STARS walkthrough. And then we'll have some future webinars coming up. I believe Anne is going to give a presentation on scholarships. Of course, invite your friends, tell your friends about us, check out our website, check out our social media. All right, now I am going to go over and I'm going to take a peek at the chat. And while I am doing so, let me pop my email so you can see it scrolling. And you should see heart@scoreatthetop.com. And let's see if I can see any questions in the chat. I don't see any, but I'll wait a moment. All right, it doesn't look like there are any questions, but certainly if you have any, my email is scrolling below. Again, it's heart@scoreatthetop. So we'll wrap things up this evening. So first of all, just want to say thank you for your time and attention. Always good to spend an evening with students who are interested and their families interested in learning more. Appreciate the time that you spent. Let me just put our contact information. So if you wanted to reach out to one of our 5 offices, you certainly could. And I will go ahead and say goodnight to everyone. Take care and have a wonderful academic year. Good night.